Hi, and welcome back to Ask Your Pastors. We talked last time about the law and the Christian's relationship to the law and the Ten Commandments. Do we have to keep the Ten Commandments? Are they for us? And we talked through that. We talked about how that was a covenant with Israel so that they might be the people of God who represent God among the nations, who bear his image as humanity was intended to. And so you can get more details if you go back and check that episode out. But we thought what we might do is take a couple of the Ten Commandments specifically that are sometimes confusing for us, sometimes maybe misunderstood, and talk through those. How do those apply to us as Christians? What do they mean, and how are we to understand our relationship to them? And so we're going to talk about one today that Clay and I have both been interested in. We've been listening to the Bible Project podcast some, and they've been talking about the name of God, and it's been really fascinating for us. So we're going to talk about what it means in the Ten Commandments when it says, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. So Clay, let's start by just maybe stating what would be the obvious for people, but when most of us in our culture, our context hear, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, where does your mind go, or where do most people, where do you think they kind of go with that one? How do we apply that?
Yeah, well, as a kid, I used to think you're not supposed to cuss. And yeah, so then when I tried to make that a little more weighty, I thought, well, you're not supposed to speak God's name unless you really mean it. Just don't just be saying GD unless you really want to damn somebody, right?
Yeah. So this is about not cussing. Don't cuss.
Yeah.
And especially don't cuss using God's name. That's kind of how we've thought of that command.
That's right.
And I think
I've been in some parts of the country where they use the name of Christ as a curse, and I think in their minds that's not using God's name. So it's very confusing.
Yeah.
One of the guys in the Bible Project podcast said, well, this was the one command he thought maybe he could kind of keep. If he had enough self-control, he could not cuss. And so, out of the 10, it was okay, I think I'm going to get that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So here's where we take a turn and say we actually don't think that's what this command has to do with. And we're building off of, there have been some studies that have come out, just some research. This isn't all brand new, but there's been a focus on the name of God and taking the Lord's name in vain, and in recent days that has been really fascinating and really helpful to Clay and I. So we want to share a little bit about that with you. So when we look at the Ten Commandments, so Exodus 20, for example, where it says, you shall not take the Lord's name in vain. Let's start with this, a little bit of linguistic just information for you. So the verb in Hebrew for take the Lord's name in vain, it's actually a verb that means you shall not carry or you shall not bear his name in vain. Now, that verb is not used of speaking. It's not a speech kind of verb, which is where we go with that command, right? It has to do with some kind of speaking, either cursing or a lot of people will talk about oath making, where you make an oath but don't keep it, and so you're taking the Lord's name in vain, but it has to do with speech. But the verb itself just means you shall not carry, you shall not bear the Lord's name in vain. So Clay, is there somewhere else in kind of the Old Testament culture and context where the idea of bearing a name, where those two concepts, bearing a name, come together, that might give more light on what this command means?
Right. Well, yeah, the high priest was to carry the names of the 10 tribes inscribed on gems, and they were on his breastplate. And he carried the name of Yahweh on his forehead.
Yeah.
And that was that was his official garb. He had the name of God on his head, and he had all the names of the sons of Israel on his chest.
Yeah, because he represented the sons of Israel before the Lord.
Right.
And as the high priest, he represented the Lord to the people of Israel.
Right. So if you think of it in terms of a vertical progression, you have God, and then you have these 12 tribes underneath God representing God, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So just to maybe spoiler alert here, just to put all our cards on the table, the idea that, and this is largely building off of a study by Carmen Imes, who is an Old Testament scholar that did her doctoral research and has written a lot on this command, bearing the Lord's name in vain. She linking that together with this idea of the priest who was to bear the name of the sons of Israel and who bore God's name on her forehead. She says this command actually is about the people of Israel representing God. As God's people, they were to be a people who bore his name. And someone's name, the name of the Lord, the way it's used in the Old Testament, names represent the person. They represent their character, what they're like. And so the name of the Lord is about God's character, his nature, who he is and what he's like. And the people of Israel, as God's people, were to represent him in the way they lived, in the way they treated one another, in the way they worshiped God, in all the law that we talked about in our last video. We said that was so that they could reflect God, could be his image bearers as God intended humanity to be. What Carmen Imes is arguing for, and I think I'm convinced by it. This command not to bear the name of the Lord in vain is about his people in their lives reflecting, representing him. Are you convinced by that, Clay? What do you think?
Yeah, I am. Just because it just makes so much sense. It seems, I mean, these are weighty commands, the 10 commands, the 10
Yeah.
commandments. And, unless we just don't understand, which is possible, always thought it's possible you don't understand the power of your words and that kind of thing. It's just more appealing because it seems to fit in. It's the weight. So it sort of goes from being the commandment that you can probably do your best job keeping to probably, oh no, I'm in trouble right off the bat, because it's such a holistic understanding.
Yeah.
So I think when we go to the New Testament, we see Jesus telling us to pray, and to pray that God's name would be hallowed. We're not. I mean, we're asking in a way God to make much of his name, but I think what we're really asking is we're really putting ourselves under that and saying, make much of your name through me. Let your name be honored through me. I even think when Jesus said, take my yoke upon you and learn from me, it's the same kind of thing, like put on Christ, put on God, and live in a way that God help me live in a way that you shine through what I do.
Yeah.
So I really like it.
Yeah. Here's the beauty of it for me. I love seeing the story of God, how it unfolds, and how God's plan from the beginning through redemption into new creation has been a single plan, a single purpose to create a people who could know him and worship him, see his beauty and his glory, and enter into the experience of just being in awe of God's goodness, and then bear his image. He made us to be like him, to get to share in who God is, to get to reflect his character and nature, to rule as his representatives over creation. And so that was his purpose in the Garden of Eden for humanity. And we see that again with Israel, who he calls out from among the nations to be his own special people who know him and who worship him and get to reflect him and be like him. And so as the law, kind of the 10 Commandments being the head of the law, it's really interesting to note that they start with the command to worship the Lord your God only. Don't make graven images, but worship him alone. And then the very next command is, and don't take his name, don't bear it in vain. And so you get the very covenant formula that God repeats over and over again through the Old Testament. I will be your God, and you will be my people. And you see that reflected in worship me alone. I alone am to be your God, and don't bear my name in vain. Meaning, don't dishonor my name by not living as people who represent me. Live as my image bearers by keeping this law. That's how it was meant to be for the people of Israel. If you keep these laws that are rooted in my character and nature, you will shine as a light to the nations. It's interesting that the Apostle Paul, well, the prophets, Isaiah, Ezekiel, others, and then Paul picks up on it in Romans, that he says, my people have caused my name to be blasphemed among the nations. Well, they did that by disobeying God, not worshiping him, not reflecting him. And so his name was blasphemed. That's what it means to take his name in vain. Rather than causing his name to be hallowed by living as representatives of him, they caused his name to be blasphemed.
When you think about honor shame cultures, I think the concept of a name becomes much more important.
Yeah.
A family name, like people don't want to bring shame to their family. They don't want to bring shame to the generations of people who've carried their name. And we've, in our culture, have moved away from that in the last 100 years. But yeah, it was a big thing when I was a kid. And I remember being in a period in school where I didn't even want my last name. I don't know how other people felt like that, but it just seemed, it just didn't seem important. But in these cultures, it really did. And when you think about it in terms of God, of representing the one who's made you, who loves you, who's redeemed you, it's just kind of perfect. It's like, right, of course. I don't want to live foolishly if I'm going to carry your name.
Yeah, so this command, which maybe went from being one of the ones that's like, that just doesn't seem that weighty. Okay, don't use the Lord's name as a curse word, has now become one of the weightiest and one of the most beautiful, because he's calling his people to be what they were created to be, his image bearers who reflect and represent him and know the joy of that. So this has become suddenly one of my favorite commands now. Now, as we said, we are not under the law in the sense that this law is not our law. We don't relate to God by trying to keep the Old Testament covenant. But in this single story that runs through redemptive history, we now, as the people of Jesus, we're the people of God. And so what God tells us is, once more, he is conforming us to the image of his son. We're a people who get to represent him, who get to know the joy of worshiping him and of being like him. As Paul says in 2 Corinthians 3, as we behold his glory, we're being transformed into the same image from glory to glory. So we get to be a people who know the joy of being like God and of reflecting him in the way we live and the way we treat one another. We're meant to be God's representatives.
Yeah, I think if you consider Jesus's Sermon on the Mount, he took several laws and he said, okay, you've heard it said, such and such and such, but I tell you, and it's a much bigger command. It's not just an act of adultery or an act of stealing, but it's even desiring something that isn't yours. So it isn't. I mean, when you can hear, okay, we don't have to follow the law. It is a release, but it is a release into something much deeper, much more of a heart condition. Much more of who we are as people, rather than on what we do on the outside to mark ourselves as different than other people.
It's God by his Spirit remaking us as the people we were made to be, freeing us to be who we were meant to be, people who know him and are like him.
Right. Yeah, the law does not produce righteousness, but God's love for us does produce it through our
Yeah.
lives,
Yeah.
that we might bear fruit to God.
Yeah.
That's why we've been called into this grace in which we stand.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there you go. That's the Lord's name. Bearing it, we get to bear his name. We don't want to do that in vain. We want to represent him well, to be like him. One interesting thing just that you might check into sometime, go look at Revelation 13 and 14. You've got this theme through the book of Revelation about God's name being written, engraved on his people. And in Revelation 13 and 14, you've got side by side, you've got people who bear the name of the beast, who is the evil one, the enemy of God. They bear his name, they take his mark. It's written on their foreheads. And then right after that, in Revelation 14, it talks about people who bear the name of the Lamb. We get mixed up in what is the mark of the beast and those things, but I think they tie right back to what we've been saying. This is about people who reflect the ways of Satan versus representing the ways of Jesus, people who bear his image and are like him. And the book of Revelation closes like this great scene of restoration, new creation, the tree of life, and this river running through the city. And it says, no longer will there be anything accursed, but the throne of God and of the Lamb will be in it, and his servants will worship him. They will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads, and they will reign forever and ever. This is a fulfillment of what God intended from the very beginning. His name stamped on his people, meaning we bear his image. We are like him. It's pretty cool.
Pretty cool.
All right. Well, we'll wrap it up for there, and I think we'll maybe come back and do an episode on the Sabbath. How about that? Let's hit another one of these commands.
Okay.
We'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.
Bye-bye.